Y'all ready to be history?
Get started.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
To the Pro Audio Suite.
These guys are professional. They're motivated.
Thanks to TriBooth, the best vocal booth for home or on-the-road voice recording. And Austrian Audio, making passion heard. Introducing Robert Marshall from Source Elements and Someone Audio Post, Chicago. Darren Robbo Robertson from Voodoo Radio Imaging, Sydney. Tech to the VO Stars, George the Tech Whittam from LA. And me, Andrew Peters, voiceover talent and home studio guy.
Line up, learner!
Here we go.
And welcome to another Pro Audio Suite. Thanks to Austrian Audio, making passion heard, and TriBooth. Don't forget the code PAP200 to get $200 off your TriBooth. A good deal. Take advantage. I did see something come through the other day about the new Rodecaster Pro 2 with their firmware update, which made me think about firmware. Is it good, bad, or indifferent?
Well, maybe we should first define exactly what firmware is for the listeners. What the heck is
It's the
firmware?
software for hardware.
Right. The software that runs inside your device that makes it do what it does. And some devices don't even have a screen and have a firmware, but many of them do have a screen, which make it more obvious, maybe, that they're actually little computers inside.
Yeah, anything that has a computer or needs to run some sort of routine and is not just a device that processes something exactly the same every single time. And as long as it has some sort of programmatic routine, it's going to have firmware in it somewhere. So if you think about the difference, your TV from the 70s, you just turned it on and it just tuned into a frequency that you turned the knob to. Whereas your TV now is really a computer that you're booting up and then logging into a stream because it's a smart TV. So your TV now has firmware in it, some operating system, but it's approaching an operating system in a sense. It's the operating system for your TV.
That's right.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
If you ever repaired a modern TV, which I did because I picked up one by my dumpster 2 years ago, a beautiful 4K UHD TV, it's just a computer on the inside. It's like a little motherboard, like a tiny little motherboard.
Yep.
And not much else.
Memory and all of it. It's got memory. It's got buffers.
Yep. It's just a tiny little computer. So that thing's running a firmware.
And the audio interfaces are the same. When you look at, I would say, an interface specifically like the Rode, I would not be surprised at all if it's basically running Linux, some version of Linux. It might be preempted in real time and have certain constraints that make it not as ideal for word processing and more ideal for running numbers efficiently all the time on a certain speed. These numbers being audio, of course, but it's a computer really. And when they speak about the firmware, I think you're updating the software. And what makes it so flexible is that now you can change it and your box can do things it was not able to do maybe the day you bought it. It also allows manufacturers to put out flawed devices and fix them.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, on the fly. Yeah.
Or evolve them over time, like the Rodecaster that you have, that I had for 3 full years.
Still has your sticker on it.
Yeah. It evolved quite a lot from the first time I got it to the time to where it was when I gave it to you. They added many, many features.
And I didn't have to run those updates.
Right. It added features that I wanted it to do, and then it added features that I didn't want it to do.
Did they ever run it backwards to you? Like, did they ever do something that you're like, man, I wish that old way was better? Did that ever happen?
Well, I can talk about that in the context of another piece of hardware. I'm happy to do that. But not in the Rodecaster, no. And I never felt like anything they added took away something else that I liked.
Okay.
But again, I will tell you about another product that has done just that.
Who does George not like?
Yeah. Who's getting it this week?
Yeah. Is that my turn now?
Yeah, you go for it.
You've intrigued us. We are now waiting to hear who.
Well, as we were saying, Rode did a really good job with their firmware updates. Rarely did they create new bugs or instability. It was very unusual. And each time they added very usable features. Some of them extremely useful, some of them really gimmicky, but just always up the ante. And it was just made that piece of gear one of the first, to me, of its kind, where firmware was so fully realized and so really well utilized by a company. I have no idea how long they had the Rodecaster Pro 2 in the pipeline, but they had the Rodecaster original or 1 in, being updated significantly for the whole time that I had it, which was a good 3 years, which I thought was pretty amazing. Other companies, like firmware is so common in a lot of devices, and I've always liked devices that use firmware because they are so powerful and flexible. The Apollo is an example of those by Universal Audio.
I think it goes farther. The Apollo's got firmware in it, and it also has software in the computer that interacts with that firmware in the device.
Yeah, the Rodecaster can do the Rodecaster is unique, and then it can do every single thing that it does. Like, you do not need a computer. However, there's other products that are more of a hybrid where they rely on a symbiotic connection between a computer and hardware. And that's definitely where the Apollo comes in. And the PreSonus Revelator IO24, both of which I own and have used extensively. And one of them has done it very, very successfully, and the other one, not so much. So overall, the Apollo has I've never ever experienced a firmware crash. I've never experienced a failed firmware update, and I've never experienced an updated firmware that makes the unit less useful or in any way less stable. They have done a very good job of doing that. Now, the feature set in the Apollo has not changed in any real noticeable way, and almost since the beginning, which is kind of interesting. They changed the console from console 1 to console 2. So it changed the look to it and added a little more flexibility. But really, the thing has remained unchanged functionality-wise.
I don't think anybody knows console 1. I mean,
I used it for
was that?
The first few years. It was console 1, and then it went to console 2. So it hasn't changed really hardly at all. And it's maintained pretty much its core functionality, its user interface, everything, all these years. But they do have firmware updates, and mainly what those firmware updates are for is so that they can support new plugins. And that's really where Universal puts their development time in, is licensing and building new plugins, because they
for their
sell
really old chip.
Yeah, they sell new plugins. It's a business model for them, right? So that's a lot of it, and so if you have an older Apollo and you install a new Universal Console update because you want the newest plugins, guaranteed it's going to say you must do a firmware update, and it will force that firmware update. And then when you boot back up, again, in my experience, having set up a few hundred of these with folks, it's been very reliable. Almost never has failed. However, the PreSonus Revelator, which really takes the idea of what the Apollo is down to another pricing point. The Apollo entry point is at least $500. The Revelator was like under $200. I think they're currently $150.
Amazing.
And they kind of replicated a lot of the same kind of mindset of the Apollo. But what they didn't bother with, nor did they have the intellectual property to do so, I guess, is the plugin marketplace, right? You can't buy plugins. So it's weird. So it's not only is it cheaper, but they're not trying to sell you anything else. So I don't know. The business model is weird to me. But the problem is that they've been trying these different firmwares to either add or take away features to figure out what the personality of this device should actually be.
You're trying to figure out the product after they put it out.
I'm not kidding you, literally. So I bought one soon after it came out because I saw the reviews. I saw maybe a video. A friend of mine, Jim Edgar, I think got one before me, and he had all these things to say. So I grabbed one because at $200, it was so affordable. And so the potential was so great. I just got excited about it and immediately got one and started learning how to make it work. And I was like, this thing's amazing. It's got, it's only a single USB interface, but it appears as actually 3 different audio devices in your system. And that was true. And it's true.
It's a single USB plug.
Single USB port.
But it shows up as 3 devices in your computer.
Correct.
3 hardware devices.
Now, Rodecaster does a similar thing. It's 2 devices. One of them is a stereo mix. So it's just acts like a normal broadcast mixer. And then it has multi-channel mode, right? So it's got 2 sets of drivers, which is very clever, very good. So what PreSonus is doing is not doing that at all. They don't care about multi-tracking. The PreSonus is all about creating mixes for different things, literally making mix minuses. Now, they don't call them that, but that's exactly what it is. And the way the thing's designed is to create for you several or at least two mix minuses that you can manipulate for different things in a very logical way. And then assign software, like say Zoom or Source Connect or whatever it is, to a separate mix that's just for that thing, which is brilliant. And it really works.
Can you cross-patch those mixes?
Well, you've got each mix can be assigned. Basically, what it is you've got three layers.
Can you send Zoom to Source Connect and Source Connect to Zoom?
Yeah, because there's two, what they call them stream mixes. There's a stream mix A and a stream mix B. And then there's the main
and
channel.
A can never go to A and B can never go to B, but A can go to B and B can go to A.
You can not have a mix minus if you want. You can loop back on yourself. Oh yeah, you can create echoes.
You can fuck up.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you have to make your own mix minus, which makes the unit a little more difficult. It's not like you still have to have an understanding of sound routing, mix minuses, and all this stuff to make it really work. So it's not idiot proof, right? It's a little bit more flexible than a lot of products, not as extensible as the Apollo. It's kind of like a Goldilocks thing. It's right there in the middle. So this is a long story, but so I was very happy with it. And I was using it for my day-to-day production, for my VOBS show, even for our show. It was part of my day-to-day.
Let me cut you off for a second.
Yeah.
Did this happen before or after you sent me the Roadcaster? That they did this to it?
I'd say after.
Probably after.
I
probably would have kept the Roadcaster.
Exactly.
So anyway, so I'm using it happily. And then along comes a new firmware. And I should know inherently, don't install new firmwares. I know this, but somehow either I got tricked into it or it was just a momentary lapse of clarity. Whatever the reason, I installed that firmware. Sonos decided that, it was too complicated. It had too many different mixes and it had this stream mix button assignment that people didn't seem to understand. Let's just remove one of those mixes and get rid of that little button. This will make it a little easier to understand. It had completely screwed up my system. It was just literally like somebody walked into your studio overnight when you weren't looking and unplugged some stuff and then moved them around on the board.
Took half of it, basically.
Yeah.
It made me crazy. Like, it broke my mix minuses. I had to re-understand the signal flow. I had to re-understand the driver. Like, it was just berserk. And their reasoning was that it was too complicated to use. That's literally what they said in their support, why they installed the new firmware. So now I get used to the new firmware. Now, in the meantime, I had already trained one of my clients on how to use the product on the original firmware. Spent a lot of time teaching her how to do this. The learning curve was steep for her because she's a voiceover coach and a voice actor. So she has a booth. She works at her desk. She coaches people on Zoom. She has students come. She has all these modes of operation that she does, right? So I set up all these different recalls. When you're at your desk, use this recall. When you're at your booth, use this recall, etc. And some of those things were unstable in the original firmware. And I went to go have her upgrade, and I realized that this was going to actually become more of a problem than it needs to be. So I kept her where she's at, and she's still running the original firmware to this day. Flash forward to just a few months ago. This story never ends. My iPad, which this is another thing that makes the PreSonus unique. I can use my iPad as a wireless Wi-Fi remote control to control the Revelator directly.
Which they took from Mo2 and they took from
Behringer too.
Oh, a lot. I am so surprised. Is there not a UA console control Wi-Fi app?
There is not a UA console control
amazing.
iPad or Wi-Fi app for the Apollo 12 years in. Still not, right? So I was really enjoying it. Like my daughter was coming in here getting coaching. I could sit with my iPad, even in the other room if I wanted to, and just make sure her levels were good and turn up if I needed to mess with the levels, I could do it. It was awesome. It was really cool. All in a $200 interface. Really clever. Well, the iPad was set to automatic app updates. They push a new app update and they jump to a new console version. So it went from 3.6 something to 4.0. guess what 4.0 said? If you want to keep using this, you have to update the
your firmware.
And what did I do? Instead of just saying, well, forget it, I'm not gonna do it, I was like, you know what? Whatever it is, I'll be able to handle it, no problem. So I installed the new firmware.
Oops.
And they added they added features like an OBS. Do you know what OBS is?
Oh, yeah.
Open Broadcast System. I like the app. It's great. They added an OBS remote control. So you could control OBS from the iPad in the app. I'm like, okay, not something anybody asked for. Maybe somebody did, but
someone asked for that.
Somebody must have.
I'm sure someone asked for that. That's like, yeah.
And they added some other features, and long story short, it made the thing less stable. It had bizarre issues. If the iPad screen would turn off, it would basically lose its mind. It would forget what's the old joke? He'd piss himself and think he was in World War II. Whatever it was, the thing would lose its mind, and you couldn't even use it until the iPad had power and would come back on. It was the weirdest thing.
So did she stick with it or did she drop it?
So this is me. This is my experience. I didn't let Martha install this stuff because I had a feeling this was going to be a bad idea. Martha, if you're listening,
that out.
That's okay. She's a good friend. We went through this. I went through this whole thing so that my clients wouldn't have to do it, right? And I had to figure out how to backgrade the firmware. Support didn't seem to know how to explain to me how to do this. I figured it out after some experimentation. Then after that whole process, I found out there actually is no way to revert the iPad app to a prior version. Apple doesn't allow it. You can't install the 3.6 version of the console. It's just once you install the new one, it's gone permanently. So I've permanently borked my setup, or I can't use the iPad anymore, all because of a way a company and its ecosystem updates things and creates problems with firmware. So all that to say is that to me, firmware leaves a bad taste in my mouth from this experience. And whenever somebody is posed with needing to install a firmware, I only let them do it if they realize that their system could go down permanently, or it could change the feature set in such a way that they won't know how to use it. And if there's nothing they can do but install the firmware, that is what really bugs me. A system where the firmware has to be upgraded in order for a software function to continue functioning, that is what makes me not like firmware.
It's not even something that like software developers are doing because they have no care for anybody and everything is simple to them and complex for everybody else. It's because literally they don't have a choice, themselves, and that's why things have to update. I don't think that's part of that. Like things move forward, and how do you keep old things working when you move forward?
So again, in the universal world, every firmware update that I can remember in the last 5 years has really been to support a new version of US Universal Console. And the new version of Universal Console was to only support a new set of plugins that they're selling you, right?
Yeah, or maybe a new operating system for the host.
Yeah,
Mac
okay.
OS,
Yeah,
whatever,
that's fair. That's fair. That's possible too. This could become a long episode. Let me tell you this. If you want to install an Apollo on a Silicon Mac, any of the new M1 Macs, to this day, how long has it been since the Silicon Mac came out? 2 years and 3 months, 4 months, almost 2.5 years it came out. You still have to go into your Mac system at boot up, go to the boot screen, like the login. There's like a low level system before.
You have to turn SPI off?
What's SPI mean?
Session protection or system protection integrity or something?
Yeah, it's a kernel thing.
Yeah,
you have to disable the kernel system protection layer to run an Apollo. Okay.
Oh, okay.
You literally have to make your Mac less secure to run an Apollo 2.5 years later. So that's something that really, really bugs me about these extremely, invasive systems that work at a very low level and wire themselves in directly into the main brain of the computer. They have access to the computer that nothing else is normally allowed to have, and they make you lower the security just to use them.
Does the Audient have firmware? Do you know?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
I'm sure it does.
I've seen firmware
here's the
updates
telltale
on the
sign.
ID22s for sure.
Here's the telltale sign of firmware. If you can adjust your headphone mix and it is done with either a control software in your computer or a knob on that thing that you know for sure is a digital knob, not an analog potentiometer.
And you know it's digital
Then it
because you can spin it around infinitely a number of times.
Infinitely. Or it does more than one thing. If you press this button, it does that. If you press that button, it does this.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Then you know the thing's got firmware because it has, another way of saying is that it's got more than simple logic. It's got a lot of logic and it can be changed.
Right.
Things are arbitrary.
Right.
It's hard to explain, but basically it makes it very powerful because it's a soft device. And George's point is that that power gives the company the power to screw it up.
Well, it gives them the power to add features and also break things if not careful.
That are loved, right? And it's very much the nature of firmware that is very often a one direction travel. It's like, what's on the other side of death?
Right.
Because once you update that firmware, the old thing you had is dead to you, and you will most times never get it back. Walking backwards in firmware is usually probably a lot more painful. I don't know, but it doesn't. They don't make it easy.
Interestingly, Apollo makes it pretty easy because I've actually have clients that have an Apollo Twin or whatever it is, and they have a laptop that they travel with, and they have a desktop for the studio, and they're on two different OSs.
And they're updating and backdating the firmware back and
so
forth.
when you take the Apollo and plug it into the newer Mac with the newer console, the first thing it does is immediately say, we're updating your firmware. And then when they plug it back into the old Mac, it does the same exact thing again. You turn on the unit, it says, we're updating your firmware. And it will do that as many times as necessary, back and forth.
This is the point.
It walks that razor's edge every time, you know?
Like a company that handles the firmware well, it's pretty much all in all a good thing. You get the soft control and the ability to modify and fix things like that. But a company that does it poorly, they can really corner their customers. I mean, the other companies that are famous for firmware updates are routers, especially with all the security stuff. I mean, that's usually a place where you want it. You actually really do want to stay on the latest firmware because often if that old firmware is not updated, there's some vulnerability into it. And someone's like, So but routers are famous for firmware. And then all of a sudden you log into it and the whole interface looks different. Just like you said, you're like, what? Like, where did it all go? Now there's an advanced section. It's all in there.
So you might be thinking, so what is the opposite of firmware then? Like, what is a device that doesn't use firmware, but it could still do? Right, hardware.
So firmware is like the weird point in between software and hardware, right?
Yeah.
It's the software that controls the hardware. And the software is the software that controls the firmware, technically, or in this case, it interacts with the firmware. Yeah, it's the go-between between the hardware and the software.
Yep.
So I think, the moral to the story would be stay firm and don't update your firmware.
If you can avoid it, yes.
Yeah.
Stay firm, everybody. Stay strong.
Sponsored by...
Yes.
Sponsored by George the Tech and another one of his rants.
Well, that was fun. Is it over?
The Pro Audio Suite, with thanks to Tribooth and Austrian Audio, recorded using Source Connect, edited by Andrew Peters and mixed by Voodoo Radio Imaging with tech support from George the Tech Whittam. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and join in the conversation on our Facebook group. To leave a comment, suggest a topic, or just say g'day, drop us a note at our website, theproaudiossuite.com.